So now we'll talk a little bit about articulation. With articulation, the key is for the player to keep their air moving. I think a main problem young students have is identifying about how to create individual notes with this idea of a constant airstream that we're going to always be pitching to kids. So let's talk first of all about how to get the ear started and how the tongue works, and then we'll talk about how to play successions of notes after that in a staccato style. First of all, with tonguing, I think it's mostly about two questions. Where do you put the tongue, and how much of the tongue do you use? For me, as an individual, what works best is to use the least amount of tongue possible in order to get the sound to happen. And I like to use just the tip of my tongue. When this is taught in methods classes, or you may have experienced this in lessons yourself, we use vowel sounds and consonant sounds to sort of get the tongue to move in a similar fashion that it does when we're playing an instrument. So the words of ta and to and ti all work very well for starts of notes. And if you say those syllables to yourself of ta and to and ti, I think you're going to notice ta 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 puts the tip of your tongue, just the very tip. So for example, if my trombone is a tongue here, this rounded area, I'm really just using the tip here. I'm not using all this back in here. Those are all back in here sounds like the, and so. And you want to leave those out of your conversation about tonguing, mostly because they create a heavy, unwanted sound. So think about just using the tip. What's going to be important when teaching a bunch of students is trying to get them to find that special point to where the tip of their tongue, the least amount of tongue, creates the most clarity at the front of a note. I think for most brass players, they're going to tongue somewhere for, depending on what range they're in. But if we're talking about middle school students in general, because of the range they play in, they're going to tongue mostly at the gum line. Okay, so a word like ta or to or ti work pretty well for that. Be aware, though, that as they play lower and lower, that tongue will come down further to the point of when they're playing very low, and for that age level, a low F might be that on the trombone, tuba, or euphonium. They might be tonguing on the back of the teeth at that point. The key point to remind those students of is that we always want to use the tip and not allow ourselves to get that the or so sort of sound out of it. All right, now how do we do this? Well, when you go to take the air in, it's important that at the top of the breath, the air is turned around. As we talked about in breathing earlier, we want a conversational sort of breath. We want to take air in and release. What we want to make sure the students do is not think of, okay, now that I'm going to tongue, I have to set my tongue up before I play it. It really needs to be much more like if they say the word toe. So you might practice a little bit getting your students just to go toe, ta, ti, just taking a breath and connecting it to a vocalization, all right? After they are doing that, you could follow that up. Okay, let's take the words out, but just blow the air instead. Your mind will still think about to and ta and ti and get them to do something like to, ta, ti. Then you could move one step further and say, now let's blow that through an embouchure. In fact, let's do it through our mouthpiece. I think you'd probably be ready then to get them to connect that to a note. Pick a middle range note for them. And I think you'll notice you're getting some nice clarity at the fronts of that. If you notice some students doing this, I'll talk about this later, they're clutching in their throat and creating a tension point, actually a dual point of release. They're releasing in their throat and then their tongue. So be on the lookout for that. I'll talk about that as well in troubleshooting later on. But with tonguing, you want a nice full breath in, immediately turn the air out, and send that air out into the instrument with the tip of the tongue. A good word to use here is ricochet. You want that tongue to ricochet off the airstream, or you want it to just dent the airstream. You don't want them to think it's going to stop it like the Hoover Dam. You want them to think it's more like a pebble thrown into the river.